Imagine you're a German grenadier dug into a shallow trench somewhere west of Saint-Lô. It's July 1944. The hedgerow country of Normandy stretches out around you in every direction, a patchwork of ancient earthen walls, tangled brush, and narrow farm lanes that your unit has turned into a fortress. You've been here for weeks. You know every sightline, every gap in the bocage, every spot where an American patrol might try to push through. Your MG-42 is positioned with overlapping fields of fire. Your mortar crew has pre-registered every intersection within 800 meters. Rommel's doctrine is embedded in your bones. Hold the line, make them bleed for every hedgerow, and it's working. The Americans have been grinding forward at an agonizing pace, sometimes gaining less than 1,000 yards in a full day of fighting. Your officers are confident. The defensive positions are intact. Resupply arrived last night. The man next to you is eating bread and cold sausage like it's an ordinary Tuesday morning. Everything is calm. Everything is under control. And then, without a whisper of warning, the earth beneath you detonates. Not one explosion, not a single shell whistling in with time to react. The entire world erupts simultaneously. The hedgerow behind you disintegrates. The mortar pit 30 meters to your left ceases to exist. The ground heaves upward in a wall of dirt and steel fragments and noise, so total it erases thought itself. You are thrown sideways into the trench wall, your ears gone, your vision gone, your understanding of what just happened gone. The barrage lasts less than 6 minutes. When it stops, your section of the front line is no longer a defensive position. It is a crater field. And the worst part, the part that will haunt the survivors who stagger out of the smoke, is that nobody heard it coming. Nobody saw a muzzle flash. Nobody had time to shout a warning or dive for cover. One moment the line was solid. 6 minutes later, it was erased. How did the Americans do this? How did they turn a fortified stretch of Rommel's front line into a moonscape in less time than it takes to smoke a cigarette? The answer wasn't some secret weapon. It wasn't a new type of bomb or a massive air raid. It wasn't tanks breaking through or commandos sneaking behind the lines. It was something far more devastating and far less visible. It was a system of coordination so precise and so fast that German defenders never adapted to it for the entire war. And that system began not with the guns, but with a single man lying in the dirt with a pair of binoculars and a radio. To understand what happened to Rommel's front line, you have to go back to the hours before the barrage. Somewhere ahead of the American infantry line, a forward observer had crawled into position. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were trained artillery specialists attached to frontline units, men who understood ballistics, terrain, and the geometry of destruction. This particular observer, let's call him a lieutenant with the 29th Infantry Division's artillery battalion, had spent the previous night inching forward through a gap in the hedgerows, moving with agonizing care to avoid German listening posts. By dawn, he was in a concealed position with a direct line of sight into a German-held section of the bocage. He could see the outlines of prepared positions, the faint disturbance of freshly dug earth around a mortar pit, the too-perfect gap in a hedgerow that indicated a machine gun emplacement, the subtle track marks where ammunition had been carried forward. He marked each one on his map with grid coordinates precise to within 50 meters. Then he picked up his radio handset and began to transmit. What happened next is where the American system separated itself from every other army on the planet. That radio call didn't go to a single gun battery. It went to a fire direction center, an FDC. A small team of specialists operating from a covered position a few miles behind the front. The FDC was the brain of American artillery, and it was a concept that no other army in World War II replicated with the same speed or sophistication. Inside that FDC, a group of men worked around a plotting board and a set of firing charts. When the forward observer's coordinates came in, they didn't just calculate a firing solution for one battery. They began computing solutions for multiple batteries simultaneously, each positioned at different distances and different angles from the target area. And here is the detail that made this system lethal beyond anything the Germans expected. The FDC didn't simply order all batteries to fire at once. They calculated the exact flight time of each shell from each battery position to the target. A 105mm howitzer positioned 2 miles away has a different flight time than a 155mm gun positioned 5 miles away. The trajectories are different. The velocities are different. The angles are different. The FDC computed all of this, and then issued staggered fire commands so that every battery would fire at a slightly different moment. The battery farthest away would fire first. The battery closest would fire last. The purpose was singular and devastating. Every single shell, from every single gun, would arrive at the target at the same instant. This was called time on target. And it was the reason nobody in that German trench heard a warning. In a conventional barrage, the first shells arrive and there's a gap before the next ones land. That gap, even if it's only seconds, gives defenders a chance to drop flat, a chance to scramble into a dugout, a chance to recognize what's happening and react. Time on target eliminated that gap entirely. The first sound the defenders heard was the impact. There was no incoming whistle growing louder, no sequence of explosions walking toward them. The entire target area detonated at once, as if the ground itself had been mined. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Soldiers who survived time-on-target barrages reported a unique kind of terror, a feeling of being attacked by something that didn't follow the normal rules of combat. There was no cause and effect they could process, no stimulus before the response. Just instant, total violence erupting from a clear sky. Back at the gun positions, the coordination required was extraordinary. A typical time-on-target mission in Normandy might involve 3 or 4 batteries, sometimes more, totaling 12 to 24 individual guns. Each gun crew received a specific fire command with a specific time hack. The crew of a 105mm M2 howitzer could load and fire a round in under 10 seconds with a trained crew. The 155mm M1 Long Tom, heavier and slower, still maintained a disciplined rate of fire. Each crew waited for their precise moment. The battery commander watched his watch. At the designated second, the lanyard was pulled. Across miles of Norman countryside, guns barked in a staggered sequence that would have sounded random to anyone listening. But it wasn't random. It was orchestrated down to the second. Those shells were converging through the air like spokes collapsing toward the center of a wheel, each one timed to reach the hub at the same heartbeat. The forward observer, still in his concealed position, watched the impact through his binoculars. His job wasn't done. If the strike was accurate, he radioed confirmation. If it needed adjustment, he sent corrections, and the FDC recalculated in minutes. Sometimes a second time-on-target mission was fired within 10 minutes of the first, hitting targets that German survivors were trying to reorganize around. The speed of this cycle, observe, calculate, fire, adjust, fire again, was something the German artillery system simply could not match. German artillery was effective, disciplined, and well-served, but it relied more heavily on pre-registered defensive fires and slower communication chains. The American system was flexible, it was fast, and it was relentless. Rommel understood better than most German commanders what Allied firepower meant. He had seen what naval gunfire and air support could do during the first days after D-Day. He knew that defensive positions in the open were death sentences. That's why he relied so heavily on the bocage, using the hedgerow terrain as natural concealment. But the time-on-target system negated even that advantage. It didn't need to see the target directly. It needed one man with a radio and a map who could see the target. The guns themselves could be miles away, invisible, unreachable by German counter-battery fire that arrived too late to catch crews that had already displaced. By the time German intelligence identified an American battery position, those guns had often moved to a new firing point. The Americans practiced a tempo of fire and movement that kept them perpetually ahead of the German response cycle. What made this even more punishing was the sheer volume of American ammunition production. By mid-1944, the United States was manufacturing artillery shells at a rate that dwarfed every other nation on Earth. American batteries could afford to fire missions that other armies would have considered wasteful. A time-on-target strike might expend hundreds of rounds in under a minute, and then do it again an hour later against a different target. German soldiers in Normandy began referring to American artillery as the thing they feared most, more than tanks, more than aircraft. Prisoner interrogations repeatedly confirmed this. The shells came from nowhere. There was no defense. You couldn't fight back because you couldn't see what was killing you. By the time Rommel's command structure received reports of a frontline position being destroyed, the event was already over. The delay was built into the German system itself. A forward unit gets hit. Survivors, if there are any, try to re-establish communications. A runner might be sent if radio equipment is destroyed. The report travels up through battalion to regiment to division. Each step takes minutes. By the time a German commander understood that a specific sector had been shattered and tried to order reinforcements or counter battery fire, the American infantry was already moving through the gaps. The 6 minutes of the barrage were only the opening act. What followed was a coordinated advance by infantry squads who had been briefed on the exact timing of the strike and were crouching in their own positions just hundreds of meters away, waiting for the last shell to land before sprinting forward. This was the true genius of the American approach. The artillery wasn't a separate operation. It was fused into the infantry assault at every level. The forward observer who called in the strike was often in the same hedgerow as the platoon leader who would order the advance. They talked to each other. They planned together. When the barrage lifted, there was no pause, no waiting for orders from higher up. The infantry moved immediately, pouring into positions where defenders were still deaf, disoriented, and trying to figure out if they were alive. The gap between the last explosion and the first American rifle appearing over the hedgerow was measured in seconds, not minutes. For the Germans, it felt like a single continuous event. The shelling and the assault were one thing, an unbroken wave of destruction that gave no time to recover. Rommel had built his defense on the principle that the hedgerow country would slow the Americans to a crawl, bleeding them white in a war of attrition that would buy time for reinforcements and counterattacks. And for a while, it worked. The bocage was nightmarish terrain for an attacker. But the time-on-target system, combined with aggressive forward observation and infantry-artillery teamwork, cracked that defense open one section at a time. Each time a German strongpoint was identified, it could be dismantled in minutes, not hours, not after a prolonged firefight. Minutes. The math was brutal and simple. If it takes the Americans 6 minutes to destroy your position and it takes your command chain 20 minutes to respond, you will always lose. Rommel never got the chance to fully reckon with this arithmetic. Wounded by a strafing attack on July 17, 1944, he was removed from the battlefield at the very moment when American artillery dominance was reaching its peak. But the system he left behind, the defensive doctrine of the hedgerow line, was already being undone not by some dramatic breakthrough or brilliant maneuver, but by a relentless, almost industrial process of observation, calculation, and synchronized destruction. The shells arrived faster than the reports of their damage. The corrections came faster than the reorganization. The next strike came before the first one was understood. This was never a story about one dramatic battle or one heroic charge. It was a story about a system so fast and so integrated that it collapsed the decision-making timeline of one of history's most capable defensive armies. The German soldier in that trench near Saint-Lô never had a chance to fight back, not because he lacked courage or training, but because the attack was designed to be over before the human brain could process it was happening. 6 minutes. That's all it took. Not because the Americans were reckless or lucky, but because every second of those 6 minutes had been calculated, rehearsed, and synchronized across miles of countryside by men who turned artillery into something closer to a precision instrument than a blunt hammer. Rommel's front line didn't fall in a battle. It fell in a sequence of moments so compressed that by the time anyone on the German side understood what had happened, the line was already gone.